Have you ever wondered what your family would do if everything you owned suddenly disappeared? After losing his wife of nearly 50 years, an elderly Montana rancher made a heartbreaking decision. He told his children he had lost the ranch, the money, and almost everything he had spent a lifetime building. What happened next revealed a painful truth he never expected to face. As one child after another walked away, only one remained by his side. But before the story was over, an entire family would be forced to confront a secret that changed everything. A cold autumn wind swept across the rolling grasslands outside Livingston, Montana. Beneath a pale blue sky, endless golden fields stretched toward distant snow-dusted mountains. Walter Hayes stood alone on the front porch of the ranch house he had called home for nearly half a century. At 74 years old, he remained an imposing figure despite the weight of age pressing steadily upon him. He stood just over 6 feet tall with broad shoulders shaped by decades of ranch work. His silver hair was cut short beneath a weathered cowboy hat, and a neatly trimmed gray beard framed a face lined by years of sun, hardship, and responsibility. His blue eyes, once sharp and full of confidence, now carried a quiet sadness that few people ever noticed. The ranch spread across more than 500 acres of Montana grazing land. Hundreds of cattle moved slowly across the hills. Large barns, equipment sheds, and storage buildings reflected the success Walter and his wife had spent decades building together. But success felt meaningless now. His gaze drifted toward a framed photograph sitting beside the front window. Margaret Hayes smiled back at him from another time. She had been a graceful woman with soft silver blonde hair, warm green eyes, and a gentle smile capable of calming almost anyone. Even during her battle with cancer, she had somehow remained the emotional center of the family. Walter still remembered holding her hand during her final days. The memory never stopped hurting. Nearly 18 months had passed since Margaret's death, yet the silence inside the house felt heavier with every passing season. During the first months after the funeral, his children called regularly. They asked how he was doing. They checked on him. Eventually those calls changed. Now they usually came with questions. Questions about property taxes. Questions about land values. Questions about investments. Questions about inheritance. Very few questions about Walter himself. The realization had arrived slowly, like a storm gathering beyond the horizon. His oldest son, Brian Hayes, lived in Billings and worked in commercial real estate. At 48 years old, Brian was a tall, clean-shaven man with dark hair beginning to gray around the temples. Confident and intelligent, he possessed his father's business instincts but had gradually become obsessed with financial success. Every conversation seemed to drift toward money. His daughter, Linda Carter, lived in Denver. At 45, she was an ambitious marketing executive with shoulder-length auburn hair, stylish clothing, and a personality built around constant achievement. She rarely visited the ranch anymore, always explaining how demanding her career had become. His youngest son, Scott Hayes, was 41 and operated an auto repair garage in Idaho. Scott had inherited Walter's broad build and stubborn nature, but years of financial struggles had left him frustrated and bitter. Nearly every phone call eventually involved some kind of money problem. Only rarely did any of them ask how their father was sleeping, how he was eating, whether he felt lonely. That truth haunted Walter more than he wanted to admit. One chilly evening, he sat alone at the large dining table where family dinners had once filled the room with laughter. The empty chairs surrounding him felt like silent reminders of everything he had lost. Then his eyes settled on Margaret's photograph. "What would you do?" he whispered. Of course, there was no answer. But the question stayed with him. Over the following weeks, an idea slowly began taking shape. At first, he dismissed it as foolish. Then he found himself thinking about it every day. If his wealth disappeared tomorrow, who would still care? Who would come simply because he was their father? Who would remain when there was nothing left to inherit? The answer mattered more than Walter wanted to admit. By early October, he made his decision. The first step shocked nearly everyone who knew him. He sold his luxury pickup truck and several expensive recreational vehicles. He quietly moved portions of his assets into legal protections managed by longtime financial advisors. Then he purchased an aging mobile home and placed it in a remote corner of the ranch near an old windmill. The trailer looked tired and forgotten. Peeling paint covered the exterior. Rust stained the metal siding. Several windows needed repairs. It was the kind of place most people would never imagine Walter Hayes living. Yet he moved in without hesitation. When neighbors asked questions, he simply shook his head. Bad investments, he explained. Lost more than I expected. The rumors spread quickly. Within days, people across Livingston began whispering that Walter Hayes was facing financial ruin. For the first time in decades, the wealthy ranch owner appeared vulnerable. Walter sat alone inside the trailer one evening as cold Montana winds rattled the thin walls. A single lamp illuminated the small kitchen table. In front of him rested an empty notebook. Slowly, he opened it. The experiment had begun, and somewhere beyond the ranch, his children were about to hear that everything he had spent 50 years building was collapsing. Walter didn't know what would happen next, but he was finally going to learn who loved the ranch, and who loved the man. The first heavy snow of winter arrived in late November, covering the Montana grasslands in a blanket of white and turning the rolling hills around Livingston into a silent, frozen landscape. Walter Hayes sat alone inside the aging mobile home at the far edge of his ranch, watching snowflakes drift past the small window. The trailer rattled whenever the wind picked up. The heater worked, but barely. Sometimes he missed the warmth of the large ranch house. Sometimes he missed Margaret so much that the loneliness felt physical. The rumors about his financial collapse had spread exactly as he expected. The first phone call came from Brian Hayes. Walter answered while sitting at the tiny kitchen table. Brian's voice sounded concerned at first, but only briefly. "Dad, I heard things aren't going well." Walter nodded quietly, even though his son could not see him. "No, they aren't." There was a pause. Then came the real question. "What happens to the north grazing section if you need to sell? That land is still worth quite a bit." Walter stared out the window. The snow continued falling. Brian spent nearly 20 minutes discussing land values, market conditions, and potential buyers. By the end of the conversation, he had never once asked whether Walter was eating properly or how he was handling the winter alone. After hanging up, Walter opened the small notebook he now carried everywhere. Brian asked about land. Did not ask about me. The next few weeks followed a similar pattern. Linda Carter called less often than before. When she did, the conversations felt rushed. She always sounded exhausted. One evening she called from Denver while walking between office buildings. Walter could hear traffic and sirens in the background. Linda had inherited much of Margaret's appearance. At 45, her auburn hair remained carefully styled, and her sharp green eyes reflected the determination that had helped her climb the corporate ladder. She was intelligent, organized, and ambitious. Years of competing in the business world had taught her to prioritize productivity above nearly everything else. "I'm sorry I haven't called more, Dad. Work's been crazy. I understand." And he did. But understanding didn't make the silence hurt less. Their conversation lasted less than 5 minutes before another meeting pulled her away. The notebook received another entry. Linda called briefly. No visit planned. Scott Hayes called more frequently. Unfortunately, the topic rarely changed. Scott's auto repair business was struggling. Every week seemed to bring a new problem. A broken lift, an unpaid loan, a supplier demanding payment. At 41, Scott still possessed the broad shoulders and square jaw that made him resemble Walter more than any of his siblings. Thick brown hair, rough hands, and a permanent expression of frustration reflected years spent battling one financial setback after another. "Dad, things are getting rough over here." Walter listened patiently. Part of him genuinely sympathized. Another part noticed that every conversation somehow circled back to money. Not once did Scott mention driving to Montana. Not once did he ask whether his father needed help. Then there was Emily Brooks. Emily was 38 years old, the youngest of Walter's children and the only one who had inherited Margaret's quiet compassion. She lived in Bozeman, where she worked as an elementary school teacher. Unlike her siblings, Emily had never cared much about wealth. She stood around 5 feet 6 inches tall, with long chestnut brown hair usually tied into a loose ponytail, kind hazel eyes, and a gentle smile that immediately put people at ease. Years spent teaching young children had given her extraordinary patience and empathy. Every Sunday evening, without fail, Emily called. Not to discuss money, not to discuss property. She asked about his health, his meals, his sleep, his loneliness. One snowy Saturday morning, Walter looked out the trailer window and saw a familiar pickup truck slowly approaching through the snow. Emily stepped out carrying several grocery bags. Her cheeks were red from the cold. Snowflakes clung to her coat. "I brought supplies," she said with a smile. Walter's chest tightened unexpectedly. Over the following weeks, Emily continued making the long drive from Bozeman whenever she could. Sometimes she brought medicine, sometimes fresh food, sometimes simple things like blankets, batteries, or homemade soup. She never mentioned inheritance. She never asked about money. She never questioned whether the ranch was truly failing. As December deepened, Montana's winter became increasingly brutal. Powerful winds swept across the plains. Temperatures plunged below freezing. Snow piled against the trailer walls. Each night, Walter sat beside the small heater and opened his notebook. Page after page slowly filled with observations. Not financial records, not ranch accounts, but evidence. Evidence of who still saw him as a father, and who only saw what he owned. One evening, after Emily had finished another long visit and driven back toward Bozeman through the snow, Walter opened the notebook once more. He stared at the latest entries. Outside, winter winds howled across the frozen ranch. Inside, a painful truth was beginning to emerge. And for the first time since starting the experiment, Walter wasn't sure he was ready to learn the final answer. January arrived with a level of cold that even longtime Montana ranchers described as brutal. Arctic winds swept across the open plains outside Livingston, driving temperatures far below freezing and coating the landscape in endless layers of snow and ice. Inside the aging mobile home, Walter Hayes sat wrapped in blankets near the small heater. For several days, a persistent cough had followed him everywhere. At first, he ignored it. Ranch work had taught him to endure discomfort. Over the years, he had survived broken ribs, livestock accidents, blizzards, and countless hardships. To Walter, admitting weakness never came easily. But this felt different. Each morning his chest felt tighter. Breathing became more difficult. Even walking from the bed to the kitchen left him exhausted. Dark circles appeared beneath his eyes, and the strong rancher who had once managed hundreds of acres now struggled to complete the simplest tasks. Still, he told nobody. One Sunday evening, Emily Brooks called as usual. The moment Walter answered, Emily felt something was wrong. "Dad, are you sick?" Walter attempted a laugh. "Just a little winter cold." Emily frowned. Even through the phone, she could hear the wheezing in his voice. Years of teaching young children had sharpened her ability to recognize subtle changes in people. Compassion came naturally to her. She had inherited her mother's emotional intelligence and rarely ignored her instincts. "You don't sound like yourself." "I'm fine." But Emily wasn't convinced. That night, she barely slept. The following morning, before sunrise, she loaded her truck and began driving through a severe snowstorm toward Livingston. Visibility was poor. Snow drifted across the highway. Several vehicles sat stranded along the roadside. None of it mattered. By late morning, she arrived at the trailer. The moment Walter opened the door, Emily's fears were confirmed. His face looked pale. His breathing sounded labored. His normally steady posture appeared weak. Without asking permission, she grabbed her father's coat. "We're going to the hospital." Walter attempted to protest. Emily ignored him. Several hours later, doctors confirmed severe pneumonia. The attending physician, Dr. Ethan Reynolds, was a man in his early 50s with short gray hair, tired blue eyes, and the calm confidence that came from decades of rural medical practice. He had treated farmers, ranchers, and accident victims throughout Montana for nearly 25 years. After reviewing Walter's condition, Dr. Reynolds delivered his recommendation. "You should stay here for observation." Walter immediately shook his head. "No." Emily closed her eyes in frustration. The doctor wasn't surprised. He had treated stubborn ranchers before. After several discussions, Walter reluctantly accepted medication but refused hospitalization. The compromise worried everyone, especially Emily. She immediately took leave from school and moved into the trailer temporarily. For the next several days, she monitored Walter around the clock. She prepared meals, managed medications, checked his temperature, made sure he drank water. Many nights, she barely slept. Then help arrived. Jacob Brooks, Emily's husband, drove in from Bozeman carrying tools and supplies. Jacob was 40 years old, tall and athletic with dark blonde hair, a square jaw, and weathered hands earned through years of construction work. Quiet by nature, he rarely sought attention. While others talked, Jacob preferred solving problems. Without being asked, he inspected the trailer. The results were discouraging. Cold air leaked through cracked window frames. The heating system barely functioned. Insulation was almost non-existent. For 3 straight days, Jacob worked from dawn until after sunset. He repaired the heater, sealed gaps around doors and windows, installed insulation wherever possible. By the end of the week, the trailer finally held warmth. Walter noticed everything. Jacob never asked about money, never mentioned inheritance, never complained. He simply helped. One afternoon, while Walter rested in bed, Brian Hayes called. At first, Walter assumed his son was checking on his health. Instead, Brian quickly shifted the conversation toward a potential real estate development company interested in purchasing agricultural land throughout the county. The timing could actually work in your favor, Dad. Walter coughed heavily. Brian paused briefly. Emily mentioned you have pneumonia. Hope you're feeling better. Then he returned immediately to discussing land values. Walter listened quietly. Something inside him sank. After the call ended, he stared at the notebook lying beside his chair. For months, he had used it to measure the actions of his children. Now, for the first time, another possibility entered his mind. Perhaps this experiment wasn't revealing who his children were. Perhaps it was revealing who he had been. Had he spent so many years building a successful ranch that he had neglected building deeper relationships with his family? Had he taught them that money mattered because money had always come first? That evening, while snow battered the trailer walls, Walter sat quietly watching Emily prepare dinner and Jacob repair a cabinet hinge that didn't really need fixing. The small trailer felt warmer than it ever had before, not because of the heater, but because someone had chosen to stay. And for the first time since Margaret died, Walter began questioning not only his children's choices, but his own. By late February, the worst of Walter Hayes' illness had passed. The snow still covered much of the Montana countryside, but the days had begun growing slightly longer. Pale sunlight occasionally broke through the gray winter clouds, casting soft light across the frozen ranch outside Livingston. Walter remained in the trailer even after regaining his strength. At first, Emily Brooks worried about him being alone again. She continued visiting whenever her teaching schedule allowed, and Jacob Brooks often called to check whether the heater was functioning properly. Yet Walter increasingly found himself drawn towards something he had avoided for months: Margaret's belongings. One afternoon, while organizing several storage boxes that had been moved from the main ranch house, Walter discovered a collection of leather-bound journals carefully tied together with a faded blue ribbon. For a long time, he simply stared at them. Then he opened the first journal. Margaret's handwriting immediately transported him backward through decades of memories. The entries were not dramatic. There were no shocking revelations. Instead, they contained small observations about family life. Birthday celebrations, school events, Christmas mornings, summer vacations, ordinary moments that Walter himself barely remembered. As he continued reading, certain passages began appearing more frequently. Many mentioned the children. Many mentioned him. One evening, sitting beneath the warm glow of a lamp inside the trailer, Walter opened a journal written nearly 20 years earlier. The entry described a baseball game. Brian Hayes had been 12 years old. Margaret wrote about how Brian had spent weeks practicing for a championship game. She described how excited he had been when Walter promised to attend. Then came the sentence that made Walter stop reading. Walter missed the game because a cattle shipment arrived unexpectedly. Brian pretended not to care, but I saw him searching the crowd for his father until the final inning. Walter slowly closed the journal. The memory returned immediately. At the time, he had convinced himself he was doing the responsible thing. The ranch came first. The family depended on the ranch. Now, decades later, the moment felt different. For the first time, he wondered how many similar moments had been lost. The journals continued. Another entry described Linda Carter's high school graduation. Margaret had written about Linda standing proudly on stage while repeatedly glancing toward the audience. Walter had arrived late because of a meeting with equipment suppliers. He remembered arriving. What he had forgotten was the disappointment Margaret described on Linda's face before he walked through the doors. Page after page revealed similar stories. Not stories of neglect. Walter had always provided. The family never lacked food. The children always had opportunities. The ranch prospered. But Margaret's words exposed a painful truth. Walter had spent his life showing love through sacrifice and responsibility. His children had needed something different. They had needed time, conversation, attention, presence. The realization struck harder than any illness. One evening, Emily arrived for dinner and found her father sitting silently at the table, surrounded by journals. His eyes looked red, not from sickness, from reflection. Without saying a word, Emily sat beside him. After several minutes, Walter finally spoke. "I thought I was a good father." Emily reached for his hand. "You were." Walter shook his head slowly. "I worked hard. I provided. But maybe I wasn't there as much as I should have been." Emily said nothing, because part of her understood. Part of her had felt that absence too. Not out of cruelty, not out of lack of love, but because the ranch had always demanded more. That night, after Emily returned home, Walter opened the final journal. The last entries had been written during Margaret's battle with cancer. Her handwriting appeared weaker, less steady. Yet one passage captured his attention immediately. "If you're reading this someday, remember something. The children may disappoint you. You may disappoint them. But families heal when someone is brave enough to tell the truth first." Walter read the sentence 3 times. Then he sat quietly for nearly an hour. Outside, winter winds brushed gently against the trailer walls. Inside, something changed. For months, he had focused on judging his children, measuring their actions, recording their failures. Now he realized the experiment had revealed something far more important. Every person in the family carried responsibility for the distance between them, including him. The next morning, Walter drove to the main ranch office for the first time in weeks. He opened his notebook. Then, for the first time since the experiment began, he stopped writing. The test was over. Spring was only a few weeks away. Walter picked up the telephone and began making calls. Brian, Linda, Scott, Emily. He invited them all home. Not for an argument. Not for an inheritance discussion. Not for another test. For the truth. Because when the snow finally melted from the Montana hills, the Hayes family would gather around the same table once more. And Walter intended to tell them everything. A gentle spring breeze drifted across the Montana grasslands as the last patches of snow disappeared beneath a bright blue sky. For the first time in months, warmth had returned to the Hayes ranch. Walter Hayes stood in the kitchen before sunrise, staring at the large oak dining table that had once been the center of family life. At 74 years old, he looked older than he had a year earlier. The winter illness had taken some of his strength, but something else had changed as well. The bitterness he had carried throughout the experiment seemed to have faded, replaced by a quiet determination. One by one, vehicles began arriving. Brian Hayes arrived first. Dressed in an expensive jacket and polished boots, the 48-year-old real estate executive stepped out of his truck and surveyed the ranch carefully. His sharp eyes immediately noticed something strange. Nothing looked bankrupt. The barns were maintained. The cattle appeared healthy. The equipment remained in place. A knot of confusion formed in his stomach. Linda Carter arrived next from Denver. Her auburn hair moved in the spring wind as she climbed from her SUV. Despite years of professional success, she suddenly felt nervous. Something about her father's phone call had sounded different. Scott Hayes arrived shortly afterward. The stress that usually filled his face seemed heavier than ever. Months of struggling to keep his repair shop alive had worn him down. Yet even he sensed that today was about more than money. Finally, Emily Brooks and Jacob Brooks arrived together. Unlike the others, Emily wasn't surprised by the condition of the ranch. She had visited frequently throughout the winter and knew things were not what they seemed. Even so, she had no idea what Walter intended to reveal. By noon, everyone sat around the old dining table. The same table where birthdays had once been celebrated. The same table where Margaret had served countless family meals. For several moments, nobody spoke. Then Walter stood. In his hands rested 2 items: Margaret's journal and the small notebook he had carried throughout the experiment. His voice remained calm. The ranch was never bankrupt. The room froze. Brian's eyes widened. Scott leaned forward. Linda stared in disbelief. Walter slowly explained everything. The trailer, the rumors, the fake financial collapse, the months of observation. Every detail. No one interrupted. When he finished, silence filled the room. Then Walter opened the notebook. He began reading. Not accusations. Facts. Dates. Phone calls. Visits. Conversations. Actions. The notebook revealed who had called, who had visited, who had offered help, who had focused only on money. The truth hurt. Brian lowered his head as Walter described conversations centered entirely around land values and future sales. Linda quietly wiped tears from her eyes as she realized how completely work had consumed her life. Scott stared at the table while hearing his own repeated complaints about finances. Nobody defended themselves, because every word was true. The tension grew heavier with each page. Then Walter closed the notebook. For several moments, he simply stood there. Finally, he spoke again. "My biggest mistake wasn't yours." Everyone looked up. Walter's voice began to tremble. "For years, I blamed all of you for being distant." He paused. "But I spent 50 years building this ranch." His eyes moved around the room. "And I forgot to build some of the relationships sitting at this table." The words landed harder than anything else. No anger. No accusations. Just honesty. Walter opened Margaret's journal. He read several passages describing missed baseball games, delayed family vacations, forgotten school events, and countless moments when work had come first. Tears appeared in Emily's eyes. Soon Linda was crying openly. Even Brian looked away to hide his emotions. For the first time, the family wasn't arguing about who was right. They were grieving what had been lost. Hours passed. Stories emerged. Old disappointments. Misunderstandings. Regrets. Apologies. For the first time in years, everyone listened. Really listened. As the afternoon sunlight filled the kitchen, something remarkable happened. The conversation stopped being about inheritance, or money, or property. It became about family. Before dinner ended, Walter made one final announcement. The ranch would remain protected. No immediate sale. No division. No surprises. But he wanted something in return. One family dinner every month. One honest phone call every week. And one promise. No one would disappear from each other's lives again. Every person at the table agreed. As evening settled over the Montana hills, the family stepped outside together. The golden sunlight stretched across the ranch Margaret had loved. Walter stood quietly beside his children, not because every wound had healed, but because healing had finally begun. And under the wide Montana sky, the Hayes family started over. Not with money, not with inheritance, but with truth, forgiveness, and the simple decision to never let another season pass in silence. Sometimes, God does not perform miracles the way we expect. Sometimes He does not send sudden wealth, erase every mistake, or instantly heal every broken relationship. Instead, He allows us to walk through difficult seasons so we can discover what truly matters. Walter spent months believing he was testing his children. But in the end, God was testing something much deeper. He was revealing hidden wounds, forgotten regrets, and the love that still remained beneath years of silence. What began as a test of loyalty became an opportunity for healing. In our own lives, many of us become busy chasing success, paying bills, building careers, and solving problems. We tell ourselves that we are doing it for the people we love. Yet sometimes the people we love most are not asking for our money, our achievements, or our possessions. They are simply asking for our time, our attention, and our presence. Perhaps that is one of God's greatest lessons. A phone call matters. A visit matters. A family dinner matters. A simple "how are you" can matter more than we ever realize. If this story touched your heart, take a moment today to reach out to someone you love. Don't wait for tomorrow. Don't assume there will always be more time. Please share this story with your family and friends so its message can reach someone who may need it today. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from and what lesson this story meant to you. And if you enjoy inspiring stories about faith, family, hope, and second chances, please subscribe to the channel and join our community. May God bless you, your family, and your loved ones. May He fill your home with peace, your heart with forgiveness, and your days with the courage to love those around you while you still can. God bless you, and we'll see you in the next story.